I am so glad that you are all here with us. So I just wanted to give a quick welcome and thank everybody for joining us today for this really special and important conversation. Just so you all know, we mainly sent this call and invitation out to our local and state arts and culture leaders, friends of the organization, but I do believe that we have some people on this call that I might not know very well, so I'm just going to do a quick introduction. I'm Jocelyn Scudder. I'm the Executive Director of the Arts Council of Park City and Summit County, and we are an independent nonprofit and a local arts agency for our community, and our mission is to serve our arts and culture community by driving creative programming, providing valuable resources, and cultivating connections, which is exactly what we're doing today. A couple of very quick housekeeping items. I know we all live and breathe Zoom these days, but you'll notice that we chose not to do a webinar format for this call today. Personally, when we were kind of putting this call together, we feel it's kind of nice to see who's on the call, to see your faces if you so choose to share your video. It's a little bit more personal. So with that in mind, please keep yourself muted, and I will actually mute all of you for the majority of the session, and we'll allow for you to unmute yourself when we open it up at the end of the conversation for questions. So you can leave your video up or hide your video using the features at the bottom of your screen. And also you'll see that there's a chat feature at the bottom of your screen where you can insert questions throughout the chat today. We'll monitor those really closely and do our best to get to them at the end of the conversation. And then note that the views, your speaker view, you may have it on gallery view right now. I will be spotlighting our speakers throughout the session, so don't think that your computer is glitchy. I'm doing that on purpose. So your viewing preferences may change throughout the video. And then we will be recording this video, and we'll make it available for you, and I'll share it with all of you so that you can share it out with your networks if you so choose. And finally, I'm going to pass it over to Tim Fellow, who serves on our board of directors. When the Arts Council staff and board first discussed wanting to do some type of art talk or conversation that addressed issues surrounding racial equity in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and recent nationwide protests that are taking place after the death of George Floyd, the Arts Council invited Todd Stoll and McLorin Salvant to join us and share their experiences and advice. We're so thrilled to have them today. We're grateful for their time. And so Tim Fellow, who helped bring our guests here today, will take it from here.
Thanks, Jocelyn. I'm thrilled as well to have both Todd and Cecile with us today, and just want to thank them again for taking time out of their very busy schedules to have another conversation about racial equity and issues as it relates to the arts. This is not a first time for them. I think they're in quite high demand right now, so we appreciate the time that they've taken to have this conversation with us. As many of you know, 2 years ago, Park City Municipal identified social equity as a critical priority, and since has worked closely with the Park City Community Foundation to plan and execute strategies to help our local organizations, businesses, and citizens build a more inclusive Park City together. And the Arts Council would like to recognize and thank the city and the Community Foundation for their commitment to this work. And I believe we have Diego Zagara on the call from the Community Foundation. Diego, who's also a board member of the Arts Council, and Diego, I think he's actually in Telluride right now. Diego, will you, for a moment, share a bit about how our arts and culture sector fits into the Community Foundation's efforts to support the city initiative?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, what I'll say is, we're grateful to partner with the city, and what it's allowed us to do on the equity front is build a larger tent to build stronger partnerships with other local entities like the Arts Council. Earlier this year, we were able to partner with the Arts Council to host a conversation around equity, access, and inclusion in the arts. I would say that it was the beginning of something in our community. I find that the arts have a unique space in this equity conversation. They are allowing us to build bridges and connect with other communities in ways that other mediums can. So I think that as we move forward with these efforts, the Arts Council and the arts in general will have a large role to play, and I'm grateful that we can collaborate and partner with the Arts Council in the way we have so far.
Great, thanks a ton, Diego. And we'd like to get right into this conversation. So I'd just like to quickly introduce both Cecile and Todd and give a bit of background. Hopefully all of you received the invitation with their more expansive bios, but just to provide a bit of background for all of you here. Todd Stoll, who's joining us from Harlem today in his home, has taught jazz for over 30 years. He's currently Vice President of Education for Jazz at Lincoln Center. In that role, he delivers jazz education programs to thousands of people of all ages and socioeconomic levels. And since Todd joined Jazz at Lincoln Center, the organization has produced more than 30,000 educational events in the US and around the world, and has an online education presence that has attracted over 15 million views. And the essentially Ellington High School Jazz Band program has expanded quite a bit during his tenure, providing more than 300,000 free scores to nearly 7,000 high schools in all 50 states and in 56 countries, reaching nearly 1 million students. And there's a special focus in their program of serving students in Title I schools. And so Todd and Jazz Lincoln Center have become true leaders in the cause for educational justice and equality. So thank you, Todd, for joining us. And Cecile McLorin Salvant, who many on this call are familiar with, is a renowned once-in-a-generation composer and performer. She's the recipient of 3 Grammy Awards for Best Jazz Vocal Album in 2016, 2018, and in 2019. Cecile's performed with some of the world's greatest jazz artists, including regular collaborations with Wynton Marsalis and the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra. And one of her more recent and adventurous works, Ogress, combines jazz, musical theater, and Cecile's very extraordinary visual aesthetic, which, by the way, her skills as a visual artist, I would say, rival her world-class reputation as a musical artist. So please check out her visual art as well. It's incredible. And Cecile is joining us from New York City as well, and was actually scheduled to perform Jazz at the Capitol Theater series in April that was canceled due to the pandemic. We hope to have the opportunity to have you back, Cecile, in the state of Utah in the near future. So thank you both again. I'd like for Cecile and Todd to drive this discussion. So Jocelyn and I are going to kind of step out of the way, but we'll be watching the comments closely for questions, and we'll interject with those as they fit. And also at the end, if there's time, we'll address some of those. But Todd and Cecile have generously offered to answer any questions that weren't received or weren't answered during the call afterwards. So we'll be forwarding those on to both Cecile and Todd, and then sending out any responses to the group. So just to quickly kick off this discussion, in a conversation with Todd and planning for this meeting, Todd, you related to me an effort that you've led for years in the secondary and university jazz education space of the issue of composers and arrangers in the jazz medium being primarily white, and in the actual adoption of those and use of those scores and arrangements. And that although of course there's incredible Black composed and arranged music out there, it wasn't actually being implemented in school programs. And that has led you down a path that now I believe with this current conversation maybe has more wind behind it to address the broader issue of decolonization of the arts. So Todd, would you from there kind of take this conversation?
Sure. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Jocelyn. I want to thank everyone for being on the call. It's interesting to me that many of the things that we're going to talk about today are topics I've spoken about for most of my career, now going on 30 years, which I must have started when I was 8. It's a joke. I see Tim smiling. It's kind of interesting. It's taken me a second to really kind of get my arms around a lot of this, that discussions we've had about race in our industry, which is jazz, and for me specifically jazz education, that all of a sudden those discussions will be taken very, very seriously. And I want to just give you a quick kind of a little story. When I was a young teacher in 1988, I was 23 years old. And the leading journal for jazz education was called the International Association for Jazz Educators Journal, the IAJE journal. And they published a list. And I'm 23 years old. I have no idea what I'm doing. I actually didn't want to be a teacher. I just needed a gig. I'd gotten let go by a Broadway touring company that had folded. And so I had moved into Columbus, Ohio, which was near my hometown of Springfield, and I took a teaching job. So they had published a list of the 10 most important jazz compositions in history. I'm 23 years old. This is my playbook to teach my first jazz class. So I take that list. We had a very well-known and very large music store. And on that list were Duke Ellington, Benny Carter, Mary Lou Williams. There was a list of music, some of which I was familiar with, some which I had not. Went down to the music store. Hey, I want to buy these. I remember ripping the page out of the journal, going into the music store. I want to buy this sheet music for my high school jazz band. And the older guy, his name was Dan Clark. He retired a few years ago. He's still around. He looked at the list and he looked at me and he said, "Kid, none of these are available." And I said, "Well, why?" And he said, "Well, why would we publish those?" And when you're 23, you don't really think about things. You just kind of go, "Oh, okay, so what do you have? Or can I get these somewhere?" And then it made me start to think back that I had graduated from a major conservatory. And at that time, I was 23 years old. I had a master's degree in trumpet, even though all my electives were in jazz performance. I had played in jazz bands since I was 11 years old. So more than half my life had been spent in jazz bands. And I had not played one note of Duke Ellington's music. Now, to put that in perspective, in terms of the volume of Duke Ellington, of the music that he wrote, Duke Ellington is like Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart, and Tchaikovsky combined. I want you to think about that. If I'd been a violinist, is there any possible way I had not played those four composers? It's just virtually impossible. And so that started me at age 23 on, kind of a lifelong quest to explore, study, perform the music of, the greatest of our jazz composers, which happened to be Black. I became friends with Wynton Marsalis in the mid 80s when I was in graduate school around this same time. And he and I were always talking about this. Wynton was also very, very ignorant of Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong and Thelonious Monk and Charles Mingus. He had great mentors who helped him down this path. He was one of my mentors as well as a colleague, and we kind of helped each other. And we started talking about Duke Ellington's music. So when Jazz at Lincoln Center started the Essentially Ellington program, the ultimate goal was to elevate the level of music available to students in schools. What was always really interesting to me was that in almost no university program in America was there a serious pedagogical program that addressed anything around literature to play with school jazz bands, whether that's at the high school level, middle school level, or the collegiate level. So when we started the Essentially Ellington program, before I came to Jazz Lincoln Center, we actually just celebrated its 25th year. So the first year we did it was the 95-96 school year. People were just amazed that you're going to give this music away, because we make it freely available to any school in the world. And it really started small. It grew. We added additional composers to it other than Ellington, even though we call it Essentially Ellington. We've added Mary Lou Williams. We've added Fletcher Henderson. We've added Benny Golson, who is still with us at age 91. We've added 9 other composers over the years. And the idea is that we will continue to flood the market with this very high quality literature. I've had a lot of conversations. That's kind of the foundation of my personal story. I've had a lot of conversations with music teachers, specifically in the last month. This is my 8th panel on the arts and race in America. And one of the things I say is that your programming is your integrity, and it defines your belief system. It defines who you are. And if you're programming, that's kind of your track record, what you have done. And from the standpoint of band directors, there's a lot of ignorance out there about what jazz is, what jazz isn't, where it comes from, what we should be doing. If you program great music, and it's specifically in this case, the music of great Black composers, your kids will figure this out. Your constituencies will figure this out. Your audiences will start to figure this out. The work is to begin that piece of the programming puzzle. And that's something that we're helping thousands of music teachers at all levels all over the world do. And it's work that we're gonna, we are continuing with renewed vigor and renewed commitment here over the next few months. It really has been a fascinating journey for me, and I really look forward to what this movement is going to create in terms of some substantial change in especially the education world. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Cecile to talk to us a little bit.
Hi, everyone. I have to first warn you that I live in a one-bedroom apartment, and in the other bedroom is, or not the other bedroom, the living room is my partner, who is also doing a Zoom and will quite possibly be playing some piano at some point and getting excited about music. So if you hear that, that's what that is. I think what I just want to quickly talk about is how I came to singing jazz, because I think it's an interesting and it's a very telling story. I was born and raised in Miami in a rather multicultural environment, and listened to jazz thanks to my mom from a really young age. She loved the great jazz singers, but it never occurred to me that it was a type of music that I could sing professionally, in part because I didn't really see it around me. And I sort of made the assumption that all jazz musicians were dead. And oddly enough, wanted to pursue classical voice. And so I moved to France when I was about 17 years old, and I went to the music school there and applied for the classical voice program, and happened to meet the jazz teacher there, and met a great deal of young musicians, people my age, that I started to perform with and play with. And so I began my experience with jazz with Black American music, with these incredible icons of American culture when I was in France. And there's a much longer history of this sort of French appreciation for jazz, which is one in which it was considered an art form way before Americans even considered it a pure art form. And I think there's also probably tied into that this feeling of we always appreciate in ways we appreciate quote unquote exotic things or things that are not ours more than we appreciate our own histories. So in a similar way, a lot of the French musicians that I was singing with and playing with didn't have great appreciation for their own French music. So I think there's some interesting sort of exoticism thing going there. But regardless, that is where I started singing jazz, and learning about musicians like Valeda Snow, who was an incredible trumpet player. She was one of Louis Armstrong's favorite trumpet players, and a great band leader and singer and performer. People like Blanche Calloway, who was Cab Calloway's big sister, who was one of the first women to lead an all-male big band. She was also just an all-around entertainer, and she was a huge influence on her little brother. And so all of these figures, I learned about Bessie Smith, I learned about Abbey Lincoln, I learned about Babs Gonzalez, who was this incredible bebop singer. I started really getting into the music of Thelonious Monk. So all of that is to say that I started really delving into a whole aspect of African American culture, which I was not even aware of when I was living in the United States. And even the darker side of our culture, which I think is foundational and which I think is not taught enough, which is the history of blackface and minstrelsy and minstrel shows, and the history of Black performers performing in blackface, and sort of caricaturing the slave life and romanticizing slavery. People like Bert Williams, who was this incredible comedian and performer, who was this Black man who performed in blackface. I didn't learn about that in school, and I think it's an essential history, because it teaches us a lot about the inherent dignity of jazz, which I think is a pushing up against that degradation. But also it teaches us a lot about the ways in which, throughout the history of American culture, and even up until today, we often favor a veneer of diversity rather than actual difference that makes a difference. That's something that Angela Davis always talks about: difference that makes a difference versus the veneer of diversity, versus the mask of having, essentially tokenism. So I think these are really important tools for us to face and confront. I mean, we are a country with, and this is not even a comment on what is currently happening, but I think our past, which is a brutal, violent, ugly past, for many aspects of it, is such an important tool for us moving forward. And even in the cultural realm, a lot of the songs that we know and love, a lot of our state songs, are songs that are rooted in minstrelsy and blackface. And I think it's important to not celebrate it, and but also not hide that. I think we have to confront these things. And so for the past 10 years of me performing, I've been sort of digging into this past, and also into how it manifests itself currently. So I could go on and on, but
so that's, I mean, that's fascinating. And something I've said to you, Cecile, is your ability to do research. I always tell people that Cecile is part musicologist, which I don't know if that's a compliment or not.
It is.
But so the idea of decolonization, right? And that's a word that I was not really familiar with until the last couple months, when people are starting to talk about decolonizing arts curriculum and things like that. Many, many years ago, I'm going to tell another really quick story, because it involves Ellis Marsalis, who passed recently. Ellis Marsalis is a great talker, Wynton's father, a great teacher. I used to call him late at night, and we would talk about things and what he was talking to me about was decolonization. And I didn't realize it at the time. So at one point, I was getting ready to do I was in my early 30s, my first big local newspaper interview. And I was nervous, and I was trying to think of, quotes I could say, things that would make me look smart. And Ellis had said something to me. He said, American music education has to stop worshiping at the altar of European music. And at the time, I wasn't, I was like maybe 31 or 32. And I used that quote in the article. And oh my gosh, I learned something, because I got attacked left and right from all of my friends who were in the orchestral world. Oh, so we should never play Beethoven again, or we should never do this. And I remember calling Ellis back and saying, hey man, I used your quote, and I just got, excoriated by all these people. And he looked at me, and he, over the phone, he said to me, well, now you know. And I remember thinking to myself, it took me another 20 years to really get to that point. But what you just said, Cecile, was really deep, was that the idea of tokenism, or the veneer of diversity. You have done the work in terms of researching and finding things. The Burt Williams song that you did on the album, the first album that won a Grammy for you, right? I had heard that song before, but when you did it, it seemed like a new song to me. And I think there's something around understanding the history of the minstrel show in America. I think there's something around us coming to terms with, the brutal, as you mentioned, the brutal racist history of our country. Can you talk a little bit about your process of researching and finding, those types of songs and that material that comes from this place of extremely dark and negative racial stereotypes, and how you then transform that into something that is a personal statement for you?
Well, I think for a song like Nobody, which was this song written in 1905, it was Burt Williams' hit song, and basically it's actually a really funny song. I mean, he goes on and on about the.
Tell people, Cecile, in case no one understands who Burt Williams is. Tell them who Burt Williams is.
Burt Williams was, I would say, was our first incredible comedian, and he also spoke over music in a way that is very reminiscent of rap. He was a singer, he was an actor, and he was a Black man who performed in blackface in vaudeville shows, and he was a very beloved performer and extremely witty, and also extremely torn by what he did and by the implications of what he did. But his hit song Nobody is just this sort of self-deprecating song about this character who, no matter what he does, no matter where he turns, nobody is there. So there's even one line where he says that he was in a railroad wreck, and who took the engine off his neck, and he waits and he says nobody. Mm-hmm. And it's funny, but it's also excruciating, and there's this underbelly of it that I think says a lot about his own personal issues with racism, and his own family line, his own generational issues and ancestral issues with racism. But I discovered that song through reading a book by Gary Giddens called Visions of Jazz, where he describes all kinds of lesser known figures in the history of American music and American culture that shaped something in the music and that shaped something in the culture. And he talked about this phenomenon of Black performers wearing blackface, and I thought that was such an insane, I don't know if many of you knew that this was a common practice, but initially blackface was something that was, I think, started in England by European white performers. And eventually Black performers started doing it as well. And they would even say, this is a real, they would call it, excuse the term, but they would say, this is a real coon show. This is the real thing. But they would still darken their faces, and they would still amp up the caricatures. Mm-hmm. And it became such an important part of American culture that even when animation started becoming an important part of the way people consumed culture, animation started borrowing from blackface minstrel shows, and some of the classic moves that you would see in blackface shows. Mickey Mouse with his glove. That's we get that from blackface shows, and so it's quite fascinating. And even up until today, we still have video games where that glove is present, which is so interesting. But all of that is to say that I don't know what all of that is to say, actually. All of that is to say nothing.
It's always something. So let me ask you a question. Have you seen the Spike Lee movie Bamboozled?
I have not.
So I would suggest to everyone, now this is a really, really, really hard movie to watch.
Okay.
And it came out in 1999. It is about a modern day minstrel show produced by an African-American TV producer who's trying to get fired. And so he produces this horribly racist blackface.
Wow. Yeah.
And it's Damon Wayans. And it's,
Wow.
Spike Lee's whole thing. But he basically, the show becomes a huge hit because everybody loves it. And I'm not a fan of the ending of it, and I won't give it away. But if everyone went out and watched Bamboozled, which it's hard to find, so it's one of Spike Lee's movies that he hasn't necessarily made available on, to rent or demand, but it does a lot of background on minstrelsy and minstrel show and about the corking up, and it is very, very, it's tough to watch. And he uses tap dance. He takes a couple street performers who are desperate for money, and then starts giving them more money. And when he tells them they have to do it in blackface, they just look at him and go, "Well, I'm going to need a little more money." And it talks about the extremes that people will go to take care of themselves. But it's for everyone on the call. I think it would help give a little bit of. It's hard to watch. I want to be honest with you. The first time I went to go see it in the theater, I went with 6 of my close black friends that were in a band with me. And we were only 6 people in the theater because it was not a hit. And I remember afterwards us having some very intense, uncomfortable discussions about how little we knew about that world. We literally, the blackface world we didn't know about. And the minstrel show, because once that, that period of the 1930s, I mean, Judy Garland did it. Fred Astaire did it. It's all over movies from the 30s. I mean, Turner Class.
And it's still done. Yeah. It's still done at the Met. At the Met Opera in 2018, they were doing it when they did Aida. And it's something that.
Oh, right.
They still do that. So, but I think the interesting thing about it is that these are caricatures of Black stories, and I think we're now getting to a point where we have to figure out how to tell Black stories that are not caricatures, right? That don't have these layers of exaggerations of Blackness, of performance of Blackness, but that are just different stories from the ones that we constantly consume and constantly see. So it's a quite complex history, but I think it's really important to understand and grasp, especially when we're thinking about how do we present more diverse work in a way that is not that.
Well, you said tokenism, which I found very interesting, and it is something that the idea of everybody in America doing something diverse during Black History Month is just so offensive to me.
It's and even that word. I mean, I know a few people who actually. I mean, and this we can go into. I love words, but I also know that they are imagined sounds. But some people have issues with the word diversity because it allows for it's if we have diversity, then we've checked that box and we're fine, and we can move on. I think there needs to be a little bit more digging. There needs to be, it can't just be we're checking off a box. We're making sure that we have our Black show for the season or our Black story. I mean, there needs to be more complex work in the background that isn't necessarily I mean, there needs to be stuff that is seen, but there need to be things in the background that aren't
Right.
seen.
Right.
I think.
Well, and it's it's like you researching a song. When you're researching a song, you don't just pick a melody you like. I mean, we do sometimes, but in general, you're doing the work that has the meaning behind it. And the thing, most people on the call, I understand, are not musicians and not jazz presenters and not, thank God, because it's nothing worse than talking for a room full of jazz people. For one thing, you would be gone by now and the other half might be drunk. So that makes Cecile laugh. That's all I need to do. But the idea of there being an American arts there, actually, and there's a video on YouTube of Winton. If you look up something called Ballad of the American Arts, Winton did a presentation at the Nancy Hanks lecture in Washington, D.C. in front of an all-white audience, I might mention, at the Kennedy Center about the history of the American arts. And it's a fascinating thing to watch. It's about an hour long. It's lecture demonstration, but there is an American arts, whether you're talking about Romare Bearden, whether you're talking about writing, filmmaking, that has not summarily been dismissed and ignored, but has largely been dismissed and ignored in many of our larger institutions because of our kind of Eurocentric training. I feel like a lot of the things that we're trying to change now and things that we've done at Jazz at Lincoln Center is to retrain the people who will be the infrastructure for generations to come. So if you think about the League of American Symphonies, symphony orchestras, they have an ecosystem of librarians, administrators, people who program concerts, people who write program notes. It's funny, Cecile, I had a group of 7 graduate students at a rehearsal watching Winton rehearse Jelly Roll Morton's music. Now, all of these young people had master's and doctorate degrees in jazz. Not one of them knew one title of Jelly Roll Morton's music.
Yeah.
So it's that systematic, the systematic nature of the racism that we're trying to change kind of at a grassroots level. So if you retrain one presenter, one teacher, one gallery owner to think differently and understand where things come from, then that person is going to touch thousands of people.
I mean, it's interesting, the word decolonization is interesting too, because, I can say this with a fair amount of confidence that I am a child of colonization. I mean, on my mother's side of the family, her father is from Guadeloupe. My father is Haitian. I'm also American. So I feel like before having that decolonization, there must be an acknowledgement of the colonization, right? And and I feel even that, I think about, for instance, some of the great paintings by Picasso. I mean, there have been interesting studies on his work that have demonstrated that there are clear African influences on his work. And so I think there can be something that is all embracing as well, that doesn't necessarily mean completely shutting out European traditions, but that embrace all of it, and that embrace also African influences on those things as well, if that makes any sense.
Well, talk about your art, your visual art a little bit, and where that comes from for you. And I mean, I remember you worked with Aaron Deal for many years, who was a former student of mine, so that's kind of my connection to you. And sometime offline, I'll tell you about the first time I heard you sit in with Victor Goins at Dizzy's.
Oh my goodness.
But I remember following Aaron, and you would post, drawings you were doing, sketches you were doing. Talk a little bit about your aesthetic and where that comes from in your life.
my mother and sister are both visual artists at home. They never show their work, but they are visual artists. My grandmother, on my mother's side, my maternal grandmother, used to do a lot of textile work and embroidery. So all of that side of the family is, on my mother's side, is white French women who have this real specific history of textile work and embroidery that comes from this really specific French tradition. And they did it not as an expression of art necessarily. I mean, they didn't think of them as art pieces. They just made this they call them, I guess, domestic work, or you know, they do like tablecloths or aprons, and you look at this work, and it's actually incredibly beautiful. And I've been really it's just been, for me, one of my greatest joys to do illustration, especially when I'm on tour and I'm waiting for a plane, and it started to take over my life, and I started to want to make bigger and bigger illustrations. But I realized, you know, you need a studio. If you want to draw,
Right.
you need space, especially if you want to do large. I wanted to do large scale, like really large scale drawings on paper, and I realized I couldn't do that when I was traveling. And so it became clear to me that the best way to make large drawings was to make them on fabric, because all I would need was my little small hoop, my small embroidery hoop, and I could just fold everything. And so I can show you a piece. They take a long time, and actually I won't be able to show you all of it. But so I embroider on organza, and you know, I can't really, it's big. It's like 6 feet. And so it's just been such a joy to be able to do that. And I feel like I'm connected to my ancestry. On my mom's side, I'm connected to these French embroidery ladies. And also this great textile history in Haiti, which, you know, on my dad's side, I'm fascinated with voodoo flags, which are these incredible flags that that Haitian, mostly men, make for the voodoo ceremonies, with a lot of sequins and gorgeous colors. And and I've been interested in actually voodoo imagery because it's such a fascinating way in which African traditions of worship were just superimposed, or I guess Catholic traditions of worship were superimposed on African traditions of worship in a very unique way. And it's funny because my grandmother on my father's side, who she passed away, but she was a devout Catholic woman. She was terrified of voodoo culture. She was absolutely terrified of it. She thought that, you know, it was evil. And so anytime we had any kind of voodoo imagery or flags or whatever it was, she was just like, I don't want to see that. That's not that's not my ministry. No, thank you. So it's so interesting to see these sort of cultural shocks. And growing up, my mother, who is French, who lived in Haiti, she was fascinated with that culture, and she would go to some of the ceremonies, and the actual Haitian people in my family were afraid of it. And so it's so I don't know, it's so, all of that feeds me and feeds my interests and curiosity, and shows up in my drawings, certainly.
There's a interesting crossover between that and the Orishas in Cuba and all of that. There's a lot of, I had a good friend whose you know, mother, maybe grandmother, was a Catholic in New Orleans, and the idea of the crossover between Catholicism and other types of, as you said, other types of worship was a little more open and known to her, being an older Black woman who was Catholic in the South, but having her grandparents who came, you know, who had been slaves, and had a different relationship to, I'll just call it the white man's church, than what we had 4 generations removed. That crossover between the Caribbean, the southern part of the United
so
States.
fascinating.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's real too.
Yeah, I mean the I don't know if malleability of is a right word, but the different ways in which Christianity has expressed itself through cultures is so, it's so fascinating and so beautiful, you know, it really is. If you if you line everything together and really look at it, and it's just it's wild. It's
Yeah,
truly.
The connections are deep. We have a question in the chat that I'm going to bring up here, that says, and to take us off this particular topic, how are arts organizations planning to decolonize their spaces so that Black, Indigenous, people of color are welcomed as audience members? And again, I work in one space, so I can address that a little bit. But again, Cecile, you've been in, you know, hundreds and possibly thousands of spaces all over the world. You know, look, at Jazz Lincoln Center, we're part of Lincoln Center. And Lincoln Center's original sin, now we are off the main campus. Lincoln Center's original sin is that they actually demolished and destroyed the projects where Thelonious Monk and Benny Carter grew up, to build this limestone edifice and cathedral to Eurocentric arts. And to make it even more real, they put a 15-foot limestone wall on Amsterdam to make sure everyone knew behind this wall are the important things. We are down the street. We are actually off campus, as we would call it, at 60th and Broadway, Columbus Circle. We're interesting enough. The location where we are was one of the places where one of the first jazz records was recorded in 1917, right on the corner there of 60th and Broadway, by a group of white musicians, interesting enough, from New Orleans. But in terms of making the space welcoming, you know, to people of color and, you know, additional audiences, it's really hard, because I think, and this gets into class discussions, right? The majority, and I'll say this now just because I've always said this and I don't say anything differently. One of the big problems in our country is poverty, and people who live in poverty don't feel comfortable many times coming to a theater in a place that, you know, has, you know, these fake standards of dress and modes of behavior, and you feel like you're not, I mean, even, you know, me, the first time I went to the Metropolitan Opera, I remember looking around going, holy cow, these people are like me. But that idea of trying to find some way to make it welcome. So one of the things we have at Jazz Lincoln Center, you are all welcome to come. Email Tim and he'll email me and I'll hook you up with something, okay? Come see us. I don't know when we're gonna be open, but come see us anyway. We have people of color that are our greeters. We have tons of friendly faces around. We try to make sure that there are people who look like the people we want in our audience at every level of interaction with us. So it's the other thing, we also have a lot of artwork by the great Frank Stewart, great photographer, and other great photography. We have adorned our space with things that feel like you would have them in your home. You know, pictures of musicians, pictures of performers. We've gone out of our way to try and create an atmosphere, and we're not always successful. I'll be honest with you, we're not always successful, but we've gone out of our way to try and create an atmosphere where everyone feels welcome, and you see people not only on the stage. We have the only integrated professional big band in America. I mean, when you talk about tokenism, Cecile, most bands you see, all white bands, all white orchestras. Our band is racially balanced. We've had a woman in the band the last 2 years, and that's an area that we are actively trying to address. But if you go see the New York Philharmonic, I mean, I'm going to tell you a terrible story. I know we're going to run out of time here. The New York Philharmonic did a young people's concert on Duke Ellington, and they played a short segment of the Harlem Suite. And as I was sitting in a balcony, because a friend of mine came in to play trumpet, and it was almost 3,000 New York City school kids who are 76% African-American or Latino, maybe higher than that. There wasn't one Black person in the orchestra playing Duke Ellington. And they had hired additional musicians to come in to play the Ellington score. And after the concert, I'm like, hey, what are y'all doing?
Yeah.
You know, you got to have people on the stage that are representative. You've got to have people who are ushers. You've got to have people who are greeters. You've got to have conductors. You need to try and saturate all of the other things. And Cecile, you were talking about this too. Other things other than just the art itself, with, you know, something that looks like the audience you would like to have. Cecile, I'm sorry, I went on for a while.
No, it's an interesting question, because I don't, I've been struggling with this because, quite frankly, I would like to see more people that look like me in the audiences that I sing for, that I perform for, and that's not happening. The only thing that I know how to do is to bring one person in that looks like me, to literally go and bring one person, like, not by force, but, you know, but I have to have a personal connection, see the person during the day. I mean, and it's happened before where I've, you know, had a conversation with someone during the day and bring them in to the show and say, come see this show. I'm putting you on the guest list, you know. I think I've been thinking about this for me going back on tour. I don't anticipate, I don't want to continue just going on tour and getting to the venue, doing the performance and leaving. I think I need to go to schools. I think I need to go into the communities. I need to do less concerts and more outreach before the gig, after the gig, not in the venue. I mean, I think a lot of the work has to happen outside of the venue before the concert, way before the concert. And it's going to radically change the way that I tour, because I'm going to have to create these buffer times for community outreach before the concert. And I will not be able to just go from gig to gig to gig to gig. And I don't think that Black people will be coming in massive groups. But I really believe in just getting one person, two people, one person, one family.
Grassroots.
Yeah.
I'll mention this, and we have a couple more questions and comments in the chat. At Jazz Lincoln Center, we have the largest outreach program in actually probably in history that we've tried to do with our Let Freedom Swing. We do over 600 school performances in the schools. 92% in Title I schools all over the United States. It's primarily New York City, but we're in 11 other cities. And that's part of our whole strategy of bringing the arts to communities, because we're in schools and we're in community-based organizations and community centers all over. So if the young woman, Leslie Fisk, would like to reach out to me, we'll try to put her on our list for next year, because, you know, in a city as large as New York, sometimes people are unaware of the work that we do. And it's, you know, we present in schools free of charge all the time and on tour everywhere we go. So, Tim?
Yep. Thanks again so much, Todd and Cecile, for your time. I just wanted to quickly acknowledge that we're coming close to the end of the hour, and many on the call will need to wrap and head off to other calls and other meetings, including Todd and Cecile. But before we wrap, I want to encourage any other questions that you may have. Please put them in the chat. Jocelyn and I will collect them and as promised, get them to Todd and Cecile to answer. If you think of any questions after this call or in viewing the recording, please send those as well. We know this is not a conversation that can be had in just an hour, and we want to get questions answered and any other thoughts addressed. And just finally, to wrap up, from both Todd and Cecile, do you have any parting thoughts or tips or advice for arts leaders, knowing that we have museum leaders on the call, leaders from our state kind of overseeing our arts and culture efforts broadly in Utah, as well as artists on this call and gallery owners, music and film programmers. So just some thoughts as this is on top of people's mind on the concept of decolonization, on steps leaders can take now to help improve programming in their organizations broadly in this effort.
Cecile?
No, you go first.
Okay, I'll go first. Not every, many of you live in Utah. I live in Harlem. We have different communities, but there are communities that are underserved. There are communities that are racially underrepresented in everywhere. It could be a Hispanic community, it could be an indigenous, Native American community. Do the work, reach out, find someone to bring into your circle of presenters, your museum, your school. Do the work, bring somebody in and empower them to tell their story. And that's the first step. And then read a book, read White Fragility, try to find Bamboozled and educate yourself. There's work to be done, and it's time.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are a lot of really great resources online. There are incredible lectures. I would suggest watching a lecture by Angela Davis if you haven't before. Any lecture. And I think there's a lot of study, reading, researching that needs to be done. And I think there also is initiative that needs to be taken, meaning if you don't see it at whatever level it is and however small it can be, then you can just empower yourself to just take one step, one family, one person. I think sometimes as organizers, for me, I'm a performer, but I think when we're dealing with institutions, we think in large numbers. I think one person that is significantly moved and changed and empowered it makes a huge difference. It makes quite often a bigger difference than a donation to an organization. I think really empowering people to tell their stories and understanding and accepting that those stories are different and are not going to be what we expect them to be is extremely important, especially if you're in a position of making these decisions, of making these programming decisions, or decisions of whose work gets shown, and things such as that. I think we all don't realize how conditioned we are by the world and the structural issues around us. I mean, and how influential those things are in our decision-making process. So I think anything that kind of pushes up against that is really, really important. I mean, I personally am trying, and it's funny because I'm Black, but I also am personally trying to keep pushing, even if it's small, even if it's it feels like it's not going to do much.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Well, Cecile and Todd, I can't thank you enough for joining us today on behalf of the Arts Council, and I'm sure everyone on this call. To echo what Tim said, you know, this is a loaded conversation and definitely challenging to have in 45 minutes to an hour. But I think we are all kind of like what you said, Cecile. I mean, there's so much conditioning that some of us, it's a subconscious. It's a lot of us are unaware of some of the conditioning that we have all been subject to, and we're all on personal journeys to do better and to be a little bit more aware of, you know, this idea of decolonization and just try to integrate that into our organizations. So I think we can all take a lot from the stories that you guys have shared, and kind of reflect and digest and look inward at our own organizations. So we're incredibly grateful for your time and knowledge, and it's been great. So thank you, and thanks to everyone who's on the call.
Thank you so much.